Hello, welcome to my recap of the game 2 of finals in Grand Prix in Belgrade. And in the first game we had a quite drawish game. Andreikin was playing a very safe opening, the Scotch was really dry, and we had an endgame, rook endgame with a pawn up, but it was known to be a draw. In the second game, Rapport was white, and he chose to play d4. And Andreikin chose to play something he played in the group stage against Shankland. And he went for this, e6, and he went for this quite strange move, a6. Which is recently played very often. I saw Mamedjaro play this in some games as well, and the idea is very simple: to force white to capture on d5, because if white tries to play in the Queen's Gambit declined fashion, like knight f3, there might be an issue with dc4 and going for b5 next to hold on to this pawn. And then the a6 move is really justified. So Rapport knew this could happen because Andreikin played this in the group stage, and he took on d5, ed5, and now he went for a3. a3 is also quite strange. Not really sure what's the purpose of it, but it can never hurt, I guess. Especially when black plays a move like a6 himself. So Andreikin still doesn't do anything special. He is still keeping things flexible, and he plays h6 here. Always a useful move in Queen's Gambit exchange variation, because you want to stop bishop g5 from happening once you get knight f6 played. Now Rapport plays bishop f4 because he's lacking any better space and any better square for the bishop. Knight goes to f6, and now e3. In the game against Shankland, I think Andreikin played c5, and he went for the IQP structure, which he felt really comfortable, I guess, because he went for it really voluntarily, not that he was forced to do it. And in this position also, in this game, he went for c5 as well. Not being afraid of IQP after dc bishop c5, which would make his development much easier, and the d4 can become quite a threat in the following moves: knight c6, castles, and then d4, which would open up the position which favors black. So Richard doesn't want to take on c5 immediately, and he goes for bishop e5. He was more ambitious, and he tries to use the d5 weakness. And now if black tries to block by c4, then there's bishop f6, and you're forcing gf, which is not the best structure-wise, because you might have issues with the d5 pawn, and then g3, bishop g2, targeting the d5, and you don't want that. Also, you might experience issues with queen h5 as well. So in this position, Andreikin just plays bishop e6, securing d5, and Richard plays knight g2, knight c6 by black, and now he went for knight f4. In the interview, he mentioned that he was considering g3, but that leaves some risk, including this bishop on e5, because with pawns on e3 and g3 being played, there is a risk that at some moment the knight moves back to d7, let's say, or somewhere else, and there is f6 and g5 to trap the bishop. So let's say if black plays knight e4 and bishop g2 is played, black takes on c3, bc3, and now after f6 the bishop is trapped on e5, and still white has some compensation because after g5 white castles, and if you take on f4 knight captures, bishop f7, rook b1, there is certain pressure on the b pawn and the king is not quite safe. The d5 is also weak, structure is horrible, and let's just show some variations. So let's say if rook b8 is played, then there is c4 as a move. And actually I think here that you cannot take because of rook takes b7. Rook takes b7 and this bishop c6. And the king kind of stays in the center and it's quite awkward for black. But let's go back to the game. g3 was a bit risky, and Rapport didn't want to risk that much. So he went for knight f4 instead. Now he anticipates knight e5 by d5 and targeting d5 much more. If you go knight d7, now you can take on d5, but you can also do this and make the king much more awkward by putting it to e7, which is not the best square. So Andreikin tries to release some pressure and to take on d4, and now ed4 is not really an option because Rapport wanted to just keep the d5 pawn as the only weakness in the position, and by capturing like this, the pressure on d5 becomes less relevant, let's say. So he tried to do this, but now he lost the bishop pair. He lost the bishop pair. After this, queen d4, bishop d6. There is still this weakness, but somehow this bishop pair is compensating for it. Plus, there's no control over d4 square, so white would like to have some knight e2, knight d4 to block the d pawn, but at the moment it's far from realization. Now white plays g3 in this position, and also important to mention is that now d5 pawn is not for free. After this, knight captures, takes twice, and of course queen cannot capture because of bishop b4, losing the queen. And if you castle long, then there is bishop b3, losing the exchange, because if you do this, then there is bishop e7 and black is a piece up. So it's not time for this. Richard plays g3 here. Now rook c8 and rook d1, which was a bit strange. Felt a bit awkward. And you'll see why. Here I think this move is much better, and to just develop with tempo bishop h3, queen e7, and then castle, and finish developing, going rook a d1 and having a slightly better position. Nothing too serious, but still it's a better position. He went for rook d1 and queen a5 now by black, trying to go at some point knight e4 to pin the knight. So now Rapport admits he made a mistake, which is something that's really tough. Black castles, and now if you do something slow as white, if you do bishop g2, then there might be knight e4 and some issues for, well, not here, but let's say bishop c5 maybe first, and then going for knight e4, because if you go here knight e4, then bishop e4 take the bishop. That's a bit embarrassing, but maybe bishop c5 with knight e4 next could be a problem. So Rapport tries to finish developing with tempo, because knight e4 could be a dangerous thing to face. Also, if bishop g2, there's rook c4 as well, and knight e4 comes next, maybe, or bishop f4 followed by knight e4. Let's say this, take, knight e4. Could be a bit strange. So here white takes on e6, fe, and now bishop h3. Tries to capture on e6 and then to castle. Or to castle before he takes on e6. So now king goes to f7 to defend this pawn, and now white's out of the woods, and he castled. Now rook c4 by black, queen d3, and now bishop e5, putting some unpleasant pressure against the b2 pawn and the knight. But white plays anyways knight e2. Now if you take on b2, there is capture, and you take on c4, target e6, rook b1 comes next, pressuring on b7 as well. So in case of this, and then bishop b2, there is rook b1, and it's not very simple. When the bishop goes back, you take on, let's say, bishop a3, rook b7, bishop e7 back, you have knight e4, and e6 also becomes a target. So in this position, black just supports his rook by rook c8, and now Rapport took on c4. And in the interview, he mentioned that he was considering also rook b1 with the idea of f4 and knight e4. Let's say if you go queen c7, there's this move, bishop d4, bishop d6, and knight e4. And now after rook e8 to defend the pawn, there is king h1 with some idea like g4, g5 to make some aggression on the king side. But I think that after rook b1, there is also queen b6 as a good move. And if you do the same, f4, then black takes on b2 actually. It might seem risky at first, but we can see why it works. So how do you punish this pin? Well, you can do it by rook fd1, trying to get to d2. But then the knight goes to e4. You cannot go for rook c2 here, because I think there is knight e4. And you target e6 as well as the rook on c2. So I think the only move is here. And now the only issue is that with f5 now you undermine these pawns. But black can actually play e5, which is quite funny. And if queen takes, just king f8, and you target e3 as well. And actually white has to play f6 here to somehow keep things balanced, because if he goes back to d3, there's knight g5. And when the bishop goes back to play e4, and it becomes tougher and tougher to defend the e3 pawn. If you go to d2, there's rook c2, and eventually you lose the e3 pawn. So you exchange queens here, but it's not still very simple. You lose the a3 pawn, and white's pieces feel very, very passive. And eventually the a-passed pawn is going to be a big factor. So actually here, after f6, white keeps the balance. After this, king h1, and now black can take on e2, but white can force a draw here after bishop c8. Now black has to deliver perpetual after check here and just give one more check and do this. It's a bit tricky if he tries to be more ambitious after bishop d4, let's say. Then rook takes, and again black has an option of going for this same perpetual, but if he takes with the rook, there is fg, and on king g7 you take it. Now queen f6 has to be played because the rook on d4 hangs, but then you just take on b7 and enter this quite comfortable endgame. Let's say this and rook b6. Well, not rook b6, because yeah, maybe that's the way to go. Rook b6 and just capture. Well, now rook a4 might be an issue, but wait, let's go back. So after this, there might be bishop f5 here. Yeah, this has to be winning, because if you go here, I give a check here on f4. If you go here, well, then I have maybe g4. I think I do have this, and you need to go, if you go to g5, then I have check on g7. If you go here, then I have, I don't have it. Maybe then I do this, but still there is material reduction. Wait a second. King g6. Oh no, just... No, I was wrong. Maybe there's this check, actually, and you lose the queen. After this, there's h4 and checkmate. Oh yeah, that's the one. So here the best move is, I guess, to go to f8. And then, funny enough, white doesn't have any checks, while black has some threats, actually, like queen f2 or simply rook d1. So white has to exchange and go rook b6, which wins the a6 and h6, or h6. So yeah, black has to take a draw here. Black has to repeat giving checks. And this makes rook b1 very interesting option. But Rapport chose to go for the rook straight, rook c4, and now b4. Queen goes to a4. Now Andreikin hopes for some queen trade on c2, because the king is quite exposed right now, and with the queens on the board, the king doesn't feel at all safe. So after queen c2, on the next move he would solve all his problems, and I can argue that he's even better in that case. And Rapport tries to play more dynamically, and he goes for knight f4, heading for e6. Now bishop takes, which is quite logical. Also, just to mention that rook c6 is not so good because there's also this entry with queen g6, and now black is going to lose either g7 or e6. If he goes to e7, then he loses g7. If he goes to g8 or f8, then he's losing the e6 pawn. So that's not gonna work out. So that's why black took on f4, which was more or less forced. ef, and now queen c6. He's trying to control the c file and also to defend e6. Now queen goes to e3. And now one of the ideas that white has is to at some point undermine this pawn chain by pushing f5, but it's not so easy to do that. It's not easy to get to that point, because now black has knight e4. He's trying to block the e file and to get rook c3 next. He tries to get this check in. If the queen moves back to e2, then queen b6 check and some rook e3 maybe, and white's king would be very, very vulnerable in that case. So Rapport tries to stay on this diagonal and to keep some attacking options. So he goes for queen d4, and now black doesn't move back to f6, even though it's quite fine. After knight f6, maybe he was afraid of rook e1, but no, he was afraid maybe of f5, not rook e1, because if rook e1, then rook c1 exchanges rooks, and it's not so dangerous, I would say. Even if you lose the e6 pawn after king e7, takes, there's still this d pawn, and yeah, the bishop hangs also. That also helps. So so after, yeah, rook e1 is also not so good. I told this before, yeah, I keep forgetting things. So maybe he was afraid of f5 here, trying to undermine this pawn chain. But actually black has e5 as a move, which is quite amazing. Now white has to capture, because if he doesn't, then the d pawn begins to march and practically the game is over. So if queen takes e5, queen b6, and if king h1, to just offer a trade by queen e3 and then to push the pawn. If you exchange, then it's okay. Black has a passed pawn on d file, the bishop is quite passive, and I think that black has good chances there. And if he escapes, then still d4 is a very nice move, and the bishop can hardly participate in the game. The knight on f6 is completely blocking the bishop. Even if you get bishop g2, f4 in, you can never play bishop d5 because of the knight. So I think even here black has very good chances to play for a win. And actually after knight f6, sadly one of the best options is to go rook e1, which I mentioned is not so good, because after rook c1 you exchange rooks and you make the attacking potential of white much worse. Especially because of this e6 pawn, which could be a liability in the position with both heavy pieces on the board. If you somehow organize a battery on the e-file, that could be a bit dangerous for black. But when you exchange rooks after, let's say, rook c1, queen c1, bishop f1, you take on a3, but still white has some counter chances by queen b6, and he plays against the b7 pawn. You as black can take on f3, but you also lose on b7 and lose on a6. But you know, black can always bail out with the perpetual queen e3, queen f3, or if this happens, maybe even something more like knight g4. But no, queen d3 is too much for black, because now the b pawn can be a bit dangerous. So you just settle with this, and white cannot play king f2 because of this knight g4 with tempo, and now it becomes more unpleasant, because after, let's say, king g2 there is this nice checkmate on h5, so you have to be content by a draw here. So yeah, rook e1 was the best option, one of the best options here, sadly but truly. But Andreikin chose to go for rook c4 to somehow force a repetition of moves. Rapport goes back to e3. Already they are kind of like 15 minutes on the clock. It's almost time trouble. Rook c3 back, queen d4, rook c4, and at this moment I think Rapport had around 10 minutes on the clock. He was thinking, he went to 2 minutes on the clock, and he chose not to repeat moves, which was insane. He chose to play queen e5. It was not the safety net approach at all. It wasn't sure that it could be a draw, because there's no forced draw here. 2 minutes on the clock, 10 moves to play until the time trouble, until the time control, until the move 40, and it's quite a big risk that Rapport took here. And now Andreikin has maybe a couple of options. He can go back to f6, and it's still okay for black, but he has to make some precise moves here. After rook e1, now the pressure on e6 becomes a bit unpleasant, and black can play queen b6 check, king h1, and then go rook c6 to defend the e6 pawn. And maybe what he was afraid of was f5 as a move. But actually you can just play queen c7 and give up this pawn on e6 after fe, king e7, and now there's no danger of this maneuver, because in that case you can just go rook c1, exchange the rooks, and basically it's perpetual after this happens. Let's say you take king g2, now you have queen d2, and it becomes obvious that it's going to be perpetual after this. Now you don't give a check on e1 because he might have bishop f1, and the game continues, but you might just go queen e3 and offer a draw. You just want to avoid when the king gets to g1, you want to have this check on e3, not on any other square. Maybe on d4, but yeah, d4 or e3. Just not to allow bishop f1. And yeah, I think f5 was something that spooked out Andreikin, and that he didn't want to play this. Also, knight f6 is a bit more timid than what he played in the game. In the game, he played knight d2, which was more forcing. Now the rook cannot move, let's say, to f2, because then we have rook c1, king g2, and knight c4. And then you want to go knight e3. So if you go queen d4, I think there is queen b6 as well. Queen b6, and you basically force the trade of queens. And with this d pawn, it's quite tough to defend this position. And yeah, let's go back to here. The rook cannot move, because if the rook moves to the first rank, let's say here, there is this nice forky. Knight f3, and you lose the knight. You lose the queen, not the knight. So basically, instantly, Rapport played f5. He knew that this was the option, knight d2. He went for f5, and he's going for chaos on the board. He tries to open up black's king and to somehow exploit its weak position. Now black took on f1. Although there is a very interesting line here, which was missed by both players. They mentioned it in the press conference. Actually here, they thought about queen b6, but they were not so happy about king h1, knight f1, fe6, and king g8. But before I go to there, let's just see why king e8 doesn't work. This won't work because there's this check. And the king cannot go to d8 because there's queen d5 check, and you lose the rook. If you go to e7, then there's this check, king d6, this check, you take on g7, go back, and now after f4, when the king goes to, let's say, d4, you can just take the knight, and the e-pawn becomes a monster. You might even have the option of just giving the bishop up after this. I think it's possible, because after you don't have queen b5 as an option because queen takes. But maybe I can just go, I can just go king g2 here. I don't have to hurry too much, because in case of this, I have king h3 at least. So, okay, that was king e8 after fe6. That's why it's so bad. But they were looking at king g8, and they thought that e7 is lost for black. But actually it's different. It's lost for white. Because after capturing on g3, now you cannot capture with the pawn because of this check, and actually checkmate on g1. And if you play this, I can take it, and I think it eventually leads to a checkmate. After this, king h3, this, h5. I think you lose this one, or is there some better way to finish off? check here, check here, h5, king f4, check here. Oh, it seems a bit tricky, I don't know. Wait, I'm missing something here. Bishop f1 takes here. Maybe it's just queen f3 actually, and if you queen I go here, and now I have rook h1 next. Maybe it's that, I don't know. But I think it's lost. So let me show you the main point of this. After knight g3, king g2, and after this king g3, queen g1 here, they missed queen g5 check, which forces the exchange of queens, and then rook e2, losing the pawn and also the game. But after king g8 there is bishop f5 as a move, or just queen b8. But let's just show bishop f5. And with bishop f5 now this move allows the king to escape to h3. Now you don't have this checkmate because now the king escapes to g4. After this rook c4 is quite important, and now black has a draw. So yeah, after f5, queen b6 was quite strong. And here black took on f1, fe6, and now king e8. And now it's different because after king g8, queen b6, e7, queen b6, there is king f1 actually, and this time there's no check. If you go rook c1, king e2, queen b5, king d2, and you escape these checks and promote. Because in the previous case you had to go to h1. You had to go there because there was a rook on f1. So here actually black has two choices, either king e7 or king e8. Andreikin chose king e8, but the better one was to go to e7 actually. And if you take on g7, king d6. Now if you take on f1, there is a very unpleasant rook c1. You pin the bishop and you make things a bit tough for white. If he pushes the pawn, then there is queen c4 and queen f1 comes next. You cannot promote to a queen because queen f1 is checkmate, so white has to promote to a knight. Oops, to a knight. And now black has to be a bit careful because if he goes to c6, there's the check and knight e6. you lose the queen. So after knighting, you have to go to e6, and still white has perpetual. After king e7, now white can just repeat these checks forever. But instead, Andreikin chose to go to e8. King e8, and now after queen g7, things become really nasty for black, because now queen f7 is a threat, and then e7 as well. So black gave a check on b6. Although here it's better to go for queen c7. And after a check, to take on f1. You cannot take with the king because there's rook c1 and queen c2 next. Exchanging queens, and it's just not so good. So bishop takes f1. Now black can give a check, but you cannot really capture on e6 now, because this leads to a lost endgame, even though it seems drawish. After this you can take, and bishop c4 takes, and this is actually winning for white. And I'm not gonna go too deeply into this, but I'm gonna show you one possible variation here. Let's say that black just makes this pawn connected, and we have a couple of more improving moves, after which we get this. Maybe this is the worst version, because these pawns are closer to the king. Maybe it's better if better for black if he goes for something like h4, h5, g4, and just take like this. And actually this might be a bit tougher to win. Let me just see. Let me just check it real quick. Maybe now g6, and after this king e4, king g7. Can you do something like triangulation here? Like this, king f4, here king g5. And then when you push, where do you go? Well, this is just lost, right? This is dead lost, because eventually you checkmate black. So actually you have to triangulate here to win the game. So HG is lost much quicker. After this, king f6, king e3, king g6, king f4, king h6, and now once he goes to h6, you get to push all your pawns on the 5th rank. g6, king f6, and now you just want to have this position, but with white to move, with black to move. So you go king e4, king g7, and he basically has these two squares because he wants to stop h6. So you just go king e3, king f6, and king f4. The same goes for king h6. You just go king f4, and yeah, it's also a good point to stay in the square, to be able to get into a square, to get to f4, and then you get just king g5, like in this case. Okay, but let's see this endgame with without capture on g4. Just king f6, king e3, king g6, and now g5. And white makes the similar progress, but it's not going to lead to a checkmate. because if you compare this to the previous one, in the previous we had G and H, which makes the king go into this queen versus queen endgame in which you lose the game. But in this case, it's somewhat different. And yeah, now this is the good point here. And now white anticipates the following queen endgame, and he wants to push a4, a5. Because you want to, in case you capture an a6, to have the a pawn already pushed, not to lose time on something, some nonsense. So king f7, a5, king g6, and now the king enters. And I think c3 is now too early, because after this you can queen, and there's a g pawn, which is also quite dangerous, and you can give a few checks, but it's not gonna change anything. So I think it's better to go to f7, and after g6 now black at least took a pawn. And after this race, of course white promotes first, but still it's a material equality, let's say. And yeah, here you can just play king d7, and black is hopeless because he has no targets. b4 and h4 are protected, so the a6 is gonna drop very soon. And actually this was the best shot that black got, but maybe around here, king e7, bishop f1, maybe rook c6 was the better choice. But still, black doesn't have any counterplay, actually, and white has lots of pawns. In the game, queen b6 was played. And now king takes. Black gave a check. King e2, and now he wants to go give a check and checkmate on d7. And now Andreikin just had enough of this position, and he went for rook e1. But still, I think the best choice here was to be more passive and to go rook c7, to bring the rook back and to defend passively. But also, I believe that this could not bring too much after queen g6 here, and now f4. Now with f4, you, of course, you want to support the pawn, but also to make some space for the king in case checks happen. In case queen b5, you can go king g4 and king f3, king g4, king h4, and to make some safety house. Safe house, whatever. But in the game, Andreikin played rook e1, and he was hoping that he tricks Rapport before the move 40. Rapport took, queen e3, and king d1. And also, I forgot something to mention. Let's go back a bit to just tell you difference between something in this position. Just let me find this really quickly. Oh yeah, here. In this position, if black played king e7 and queen takes g7, king d6. In case of this check on f8, this is a draw now. After king c7, you might think at first that this is winning for white because now you promote on the next move. There's no way to avoid this, but actually after queen b6, king f1, we have something similar to the game, but in this case, queen is on f8. And there's no way that this queen can support the king. unless by some miracle you get to f4 and get to f5. But black goes here, king e2, and now rook e1. And because of this queen, which is misplaced on f8, there's no perpetual. There's perpetual. Because after this, you can just... If the king goes to the queen side, you can go give checks on the third rank. If it goes to f1, you just go to d3, king g1, queen e3. And once again, you don't give a check when the king is on g1. You don't give a check on the first rank because it allows bishop f1. You give a check either on d4 or e3. If you remember the previous couple of minutes ago, I told the same. And yeah, this is just a draw in this case. You just be careful not to give a check while here. Do not give a check like this, because after bishop f1 the h3 becomes available. And yeah, but in this position, let's go to the game now. In the game we had this one, and the queen is here on g7, which means that white's king has to go to a2 somehow. And also it's very important that the queen covers c3. So Rapport goes to d1, queen d3, check, check, check. Now he repeats, and now queen e3. Back, king b2, and now black gave one more check, king a1, one more check, king a2, and now you cannot give this check because of queen b2, and black has only one check here, but after queen a1 it's very important that the bishop is on h3 because it covers f1. So black goes for this one, and after king b2, queen e2 check, king a1. Now black would like to have black would love to have this mechanism of queen f1, queen c4, but the bishop on h3 makes it quite difficult. And now if you go queen e1, then there's this, and after queen e2, queen b2, queen c4, and again after this the bishop is a hero, MVP, and that means the game is over. So after king a1, Andreikin thought for a while, and finally he played queen f1. And I think this was a quite funny moment. They both had a laugh. After bishop f1, Andreikin resigned and they both shared a laugh. And that's how Rapport won this Grand Prix Leg 2. And by this win he went to have 20 points in total, and yeah, now he's a big favorite to qualify for candidates. In some scenarios he can drop out, let's say if Hikaru loses in the final against MVL, Giri or Dominguez, but I think that's not going to happen. But let's not jinx it. So yeah, that's it. Thank you so much for watching this, and see you very